There is a question that has followed one man through 23 centuries, repeated in libraries, in tents, in palaces, and now, perhaps, in the quiet room where you are lying tonight. How does a boy from a small, half-forgotten kingdom in the northern hills of Greece become the ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, before he turns 33 years old? It is not a simple question, and there is no simple answer. Historians have argued about him for over 2,000 years. Some called him a god, some called him a butcher, some called him a visionary who tried to weave the entire known world into a single fabric of shared cities, shared language, and shared ideas. Perhaps he was all of these things at once, depending on the hour of the day you asked him, or the mood of the man standing beside you. Tonight, we are not going to rush toward the battles, though there will be battles. We are not going to leap straight to the famous names, Darius, Bucephalus, Babylon, though they will all arrive in time. Instead, we are going to do something slower, and perhaps something kinder to your tired mind. We are going to walk gently into the world that made him. We will feel the wind coming down off Mount Olympus into the valleys of Macedon. We will smell the wood smoke of a mountain village at dusk. We will sit for a while in the court of a king who was, in his own right, one of the most remarkable men of his age, long before his son eclipsed him. We will let the story breathe. Let yourself soften into the pillow. There is no test at the end of this. There is only a story, old as stone, and a voice that will carry you gently through it, for as long as you need, until sleep finds you somewhere along the road. We begin not with a crown, but with a mountain. To understand the man, you must first understand the place that shaped him. And the place was unlike anywhere else in the Greek-speaking world of the 4th century before our era. Picture, if you will, a landscape of contrasts. To the south lay the glittering city-states that most people even now think of when they hear the word Greece. Athens with its marble temples and its restless democracy, Sparta with its iron discipline, Thebes with its sacred band of soldiers bound by loyalty and love. These cities looked north, toward Macedon, the way a wealthy, sophisticated cousin might look at a rough relative from the provinces. They considered the Macedonians only half Greek. They mocked their accent, their manners, their kings who still hunted wild boar with spears and drank their wine unmixed with water in the old, unrefined way. But Macedon was no small thing. It stretched across a broad, fertile plain in the north, ringed by mountains that rose sharply toward the sky. Olympus itself, home of the gods in the old stories, stood at its southern border, its peak often lost in cloud. To the west and north rose more ranges, rugged and forested, home to wolves, bears and tribes who had resisted control for generations. Rivers ran down from these highlands to the plain below, carrying silt that made the lowland soil rich and generous. Wheat grew here. Horses were bred here, strong and swift, prized across the Greek world. Timber came down from the mountain forests, feeding shipyards as far away as Athens, which had few good forests of its own. This was a land of extremes. Winters in the highlands could be brutal, snow piling against timber houses, smoke curling from hearths as families huddled close, telling stories through the long dark evenings. Summers turned the lowland plain golden and dry, the air humming with insects. Farmers moving through wheat fields with the unhurried rhythm of people who had done this work for as long as memory reached back. The Macedonians were at heart a rural people. Their great cities were modest compared to Athens. Their wealth lay not in marble and philosophy, but in horses, timber, grain, and above all, in loyalty, the fierce personal loyalty of warrior nobles to a king who could outhunt them, outdrink them, and outfight them. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. In the south, kingship had faded away centuries earlier, replaced by assemblies, councils, elected officials, the machinery of early democracy and oligarchy. But in Macedon, the king still ruled in the old way, not as a distant, untouchable monarch hidden behind palace walls, but as a war leader who ate at the same table as his nobles, hunted beside them, and had to prove again and again that he deserved to lead them. A Macedonian king who could not win battles, who could not command the personal devotion of his companions, did not remain king for long. Assassination was not a distant threat in Macedonian court life. It was, tragically, almost a normal hazard of the throne. Into this rugged, proud and dangerous world, in the middle of the 4th century before our era, a young man named Philip came to power. And it is here, with Philip, long before his son's birth, that our story must properly begin. because without Philip there would have been no Alexander the Great. There would only have been a minor Macedonian prince, born into a kingdom that history might easily have forgotten. When Philip took the throne, Macedon was a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. His brother, King Perdiccas III, had died in battle against the Illyrians, a fierce people from the mountains to the west, and had taken 4,000 Macedonian soldiers down with him. The kingdom was suddenly leaderless, its army shattered, its treasury nearly empty, its borders under pressure from every direction at once. To the west, the Illyrians smelled weakness and prepared to press further into Macedonian territory. To the north, the Paeonians raided at will. To the east, the Thracians watched with interest. And various Greek cities to the south, along with rival claimants to the Macedonian throne itself, circled like men waiting for a wounded animal to finally fall. Philip was in his early 20s. He had spent several years as a hostage in Thebes, sent there as a boy to guarantee a peace treaty. And it was there, ironically, that this young Macedonian prince had received an education that would change the fate of the ancient world. Thebes was, at that moment, home to some of the finest military minds in Greece. Philip watched and listened and learned. He studied the tactics of Epaminondas, the Theban general whose innovations on the battlefield had shocked and defeated even the legendary Spartans. He learned how discipline, formation, and clever positioning could overcome even superior numbers. He learned, too, something about diplomacy, about how Greek city-states negotiated, postured, and broke their promises to one another. When Philip returned to Macedon and took the throne, first as regent for his infant nephew, and soon after, when the danger to the kingdom demanded a full king rather than a caretaker, as king in his own right, he brought with him a rare combination of qualities. He was patient where his predecessors had been reckless. He was calculating where they had been proud. And he understood, in a way few Macedonian rulers before him had, that the survival of his kingdom depended on rebuilding it from the ground up. Not just its army, but its economy, its diplomacy, its very sense of itself. He began with the army, because the army was what had failed his brother, and the army was what would either save Macedon or bury it entirely. Here is where we must pause and imagine the scene, because what Philip built on the training grounds outside Pella, the Macedonian capital, would become one of the most feared and effective fighting forces the ancient world had ever seen. Picture rows of young men, farmers' sons and shepherds' sons alongside the sons of minor nobility, standing in the pale morning light, sweat already soaking through their tunics though the sun has barely cleared the mountains. In their hands they hold a weapon longer than anything used before in Greek warfare, a spear some 18 feet in length, called the sarissa, far too long and heavy to be wielded with one hand like the traditional Greek spear. It requires both hands, discipline, and hours upon hours of drilling, until the movement becomes instinct rather than thought. Philip organized his infantry into a formation called the phalanx, tightly packed ranks of men whose sarissas, when leveled forward, created a wall of iron points that no cavalry charge and few infantry lines could safely approach. 5, 6, even more rows of spear points projected forward from a single formation, so that even soldiers in the back ranks contributed their weapons to the deadly hedge bristling toward the enemy. It was slow to maneuver, and it required extraordinary discipline and trust. Each man's safety depended entirely on the men beside him holding their position. But where it could be brought to bear on open, level ground, it was nearly unstoppable. But Philip did not build an army of one weapon alone. He paired his phalanx with something the Greek city-states had rarely used to full effect. Heavy cavalry, made up of Macedonian nobles who had grown up on horseback, hunting boar and deer through mountain forests since childhood. These horsemen, called the companions, would become the hammer to the phalanx's anvil. While the infantry held an enemy line in place, the cavalry would sweep around the flank and drive into the enemy's rear or side, shattering their formation entirely. He also transformed Macedon's economy to pay for all of this. He seized control of gold and silver mines near Mount Pangaean, in the region east of Macedon, and the wealth that poured from those mines funded not only his army, but his diplomacy, because Philip understood something that many warrior kings before him had not. That gold could sometimes win a war more cheaply and more permanently than iron. He famously remarked, according to later historians, that no city wall was so strong that a donkey loaded with gold could not climb it. Bribery, marriage alliances, calculated betrayals, and patient diplomacy became tools he wielded as skillfully as any general wielded a sword. Over roughly 2 decades, Philip transformed Macedon from a fractured, vulnerable kingdom on the edge of collapse into the dominant power of the entire Greek world. He subdued the Illyrians and Paeonians who had once threatened to overrun the kingdom. He expanded eastward into Thrace, securing the gold mines and rich farmland there. And gradually, city by city, alliance by alliance, and eventually battle by battle, he brought the proud city-states of southern Greece, Athens, Thebes, and their allies under Macedonian influence, culminating in a decisive battle we will return to later in our story, at a place called Chaeronea. It is important, as we drift through this history, to understand Philip clearly, because so much of what Alexander would later achieve was built upon foundations his father laid, often at great personal cost, and after tremendous patience. Philip lost an eye during a siege, struck by an arrow while inspecting his troops. He suffered a shattered collarbone and a crippled leg in other campaigns. He carried, by the time of his death, the scars of a lifetime spent almost constantly at war, negotiating, marching, besieging, and rebuilding. He was not a gentleman by any account that survives. He was ambitious, often ruthless, and fond of wine and feasting in ways that sometimes embarrassed his own court. But he was also, by any measure, one of the most capable rulers of his age. A man who took a kingdom on the brink of extinction and forged it into the most powerful military state in the ancient Mediterranean world. And into the household of this remarkable, complicated king, in the summer of the year 356 before our era, a son was born. The ancient sources, and we should always remember gently, that ancient sources often blend fact with flattering legend, especially when writing about a man who would later be worshipped in parts of his empire as something more than mortal. Tell us that several remarkable things were said to have happened on the night of Alexander's birth. It was said that the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the most magnificent buildings in the entire Greek world, burned to the ground that very night. Later writers could not resist connecting these two events, suggesting that the goddess herself had been too busy attending the birth of a future world conqueror to protect her own temple from the flames. It is a beautiful story. It is almost certainly just that, a story added later, once Alexander's life had become the stuff of legend and people wanted his birth to feel as extraordinary as his deeds. It was also said that Philip, away on campaign at the time, received 3 pieces of good news on the very same day: that his general Parmenion had won a great victory over the Illyrians, that his racehorse had won at the Olympic Games, and that his son had been born. 3 victories in a single day, the story goes, and a soothsayer supposedly told him that a child born under such a triple sign of fortune would prove invincible. We cannot know how much of this is true. What we can know, with more confidence, is who this child's parents were and what kind of household he was born into, because that household, filled with tension, ambition, mysticism, and fierce personal will, would shape him as much as any battlefield later would. His mother was Olympias, a princess from the kingdom of Epirus, to the west of Macedon, a land of rugged mountains and ancient oracles. Olympias was, by every ancient account, an extraordinarily forceful personality, proud, intensely devoted to the mystery religions and ecstatic worship practices of her homeland, and utterly devoted to the destiny of her son. Some ancient writers claim she kept snakes as part of religious rites connected to the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstatic revelation, and that Philip himself was said to have once glimpsed something in her bedchamber that unsettled him deeply, though what exactly he saw remains obscured by centuries of retelling and rumour. Olympias believed, or at least she encouraged others to believe, that her son's true father was not Philip at all, but the god Zeus himself, who had come to her in the form of a serpent or a bolt of lightning, depending on which version of the tale you hear, whether she believed this literally, or whether it was a piece of calculated political mythology designed to elevate her son's status, we cannot say for certain. What we can say is that Alexander grew up in a household where his mother constantly, insistently, reminded him that he was destined for something extraordinary, perhaps even something divine. This is worth sitting with for a moment, in the quiet of your own thoughts tonight. Imagine being a child raised not simply with love or discipline or the ordinary hopes any parent has for a son, but with a mother's relentless conviction that you are marked by the gods themselves for greatness. It is a heavy kind of gift to carry. It can build an extraordinary confidence in a person. It can also build a restlessness that never quite settles, a sense that ordinary human limits were never meant to apply to you. Philip, for his part, loved his son. The ancient sources agree on this, even amid the family's later, bitter conflicts. But their relationship, like so much in this family, was never simple. Philip had other wives, other children, according to the Macedonian custom of the time, which permitted a king multiple marriages, often for the sake of alliance and diplomacy rather than romance alone. Olympias, fiercely protective of her son's position as heir, watched these other marriages with wary, calculating eyes, and the tension between mother and father would eventually erupt into one of the most consequential family conflicts in ancient history. But that lies further down our road tonight. For now, let us simply picture the household as it was in Alexander's earliest years, a royal court in the Macedonian capital of Pella, filled with warriors, hunters, wine, ambition, and, at its centre, a boy being raised to believe that the world itself might one day belong to him. Let us walk, for a while, through the world of Alexander's childhood, because it is easy, when we speak of world conquerors, to forget that they were once simply children, running through palace courtyards, afraid of the dark, curious about insects and stories, and the shapes of clouds. Pella, the Macedonian capital, was not yet the grand city it would later become under further building projects, but it was already an impressive royal seat, built near a lake connected to the sea by a channel, allowing ships to bring goods directly to the palace district. The palace itself sat on raised ground, overlooking the lower town where merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers' families lived their daily lives. Mosaic floors, a distinctive Macedonian art form made from small, naturally coloured pebbles rather than the cut glass tiles used elsewhere in the Greek world, decorated the floors of the wealthier households, depicting hunting scenes, mythological figures, and geometric patterns that would have caught a child's eye during long afternoons indoors. Beyond the palace walls, ordinary Macedonian life carried on in its familiar rhythms. Farmers rose before dawn to tend wheat fields and vineyards. Shepherds drove their flocks up into the hill pastures as the weather warmed each spring, following ancient seasonal routes their families had walked for generations, and brought them back down as autumn approached. Blacksmiths worked at forges, producing the tools of both farming and war, ploughshares in peacetime, spearheads and armour when campaigns called the men away. Women managed households, wove cloth on upright looms, prepared meals of barley bread, olive oil, cheese, and whatever the season provided, from spring greens to autumn's stored grain and dried fruit. Children of common families worked alongside their parents from a young age, learning the trades and tasks that would define their adult lives, with little of the formal education reserved for the aristocracy. For a prince like Alexander, though, childhood held different expectations from the very beginning. Macedonian noble boys were raised, above all, for two things: leadership and war. From an early age, Alexander would have been placed among the sons of Macedonian nobility, a group of boys who would grow up together, train together, and eventually serve as his closest companions and commanders in the campaigns that lay ahead. This was a deliberate and important feature of Macedonian royal upbringing. A future king was not raised in isolation, surrounded only by servants and tutors, but alongside the very peers who would one day fight and die beside him, or against him, depending on how loyalty held. Physical training formed a central part of this upbringing. Hunting, in particular, held enormous importance in Macedonian culture. A young nobleman was not considered fully a man, according to custom, until he had killed a wild boar without the aid of a hunting net, a genuinely dangerous feat given how fast and vicious a cornered boar could be. Riding, too, was essential, and Macedonian boys were placed on horseback from a very young age, developing the seat and confidence that would later make Macedonian cavalry so formidable on the battlefield. It was during these childhood years, according to the most famous story of Alexander's youth, that an incident occurred which the ancient biographer Plutarch later recorded in vivid detail. A story so well loved and so revealing of the character that would define Alexander's adult life that it deserves to be told slowly and carefully. A horse trader from Thessaly, a region famous for producing excellent horses, arrived at the Macedonian court one day with a magnificent animal for sale, a stallion of extraordinary size and spirit, black in colour, with a distinctive white marking on his forehead and, according to some accounts, a head shaped somewhat like an ox, which may be the origin of the name he would carry for the rest of his life. Bucephalus, meaning ox head. The horse trader asked an enormous price for the animal, and Philip and his court gathered to watch a demonstration of the horse's quality before agreeing to such a sum. But when the grooms attempted to mount him, Bucephalus reared, bucked, and refused to allow any rider near him. He was, by every appearance, wild, untamable, and dangerous, the kind of horse that ends up either gelded into submission, sold cheaply as breeding stock, or simply turned away. Philip, watching this display of failed attempts, grew frustrated and ordered the horse led away, declaring it useless and too dangerous to keep. It was at this moment, the story tells us, that young Alexander, some accounts suggest he was around 12 or 13 years old at the time, spoke up, insisting that the men were losing a magnificent horse simply because they lacked the skill and patience to manage him. Philip, amused or perhaps irritated by his son's confidence, challenged him if Alexander believed he could succeed where grown men had failed, and failed badly. Let him try, and if he failed as well, let him bear the cost of his own boldness. Alexander approached the horse calmly. He had noticed something the other men, in their haste and frustration, had missed. Bucephalus was not afraid of people, or of the whip, or of unfamiliar sounds. He was afraid of his own shadow, which shifted and danced unpredictably on the ground before him each time he moved, appearing to the horse as some kind of pursuing creature he could never quite escape. Alexander turned the horse to face directly into the sun, so that his shadow fell behind him, out of sight, and spoke to him gently, stroking his neck, allowing the animal time to settle. Then, in one smooth motion, while the horse remained calm, he swung himself onto Bucephalus's back and let him run, not fighting him, not forcing him, simply allowing the horse to release his pent-up energy across the open ground, before gradually bringing him back under gentle control. The watching court, we are told, fell into stunned silence and then into applause. Philip, moved to tears according to Plutarch's account, is said to have embraced his son and told him that Macedon was too small a kingdom for him, that he would need to search for a realm equal to the size of his ambitions. Whether every detail of this story happened precisely as recorded, or whether it was polished and embellished over the centuries by writers eager to find early signs of Alexander's greatness, we cannot say with certainty. This is often the challenge of history, separating what genuinely occurred from what people later wished had occurred, because it fits so perfectly with everything that came after. But even if we hold the story gently, with appropriate caution, it captures something true about how Alexander was remembered by those who knew him and those who studied his life afterward. A young man who noticed what others overlooked, who combined patience with boldness, and who trusted his own judgment even against the doubts of grown men around him. Bucephalus, in any case, became Alexander's companion for the next 2 decades, carrying him through campaign after campaign across deserts and mountains and rivers, until the horse's death, from age, or wounds, or simple exhaustion, depending on the account, deep in the heart of Asia, thousands of miles from the pastures of Macedon, where he had first been tamed. When Bucephalus eventually died, Alexander would found a city and name it in the horse's honour, a gesture of genuine grief and gratitude from a man not often given to sentiment in the historical record. As Alexander approached his early teenage years, Philip turned his attention to a different kind of education for his son, one that would shape not just his body and his courage, but his mind. For this task, Philip made a choice that would echo through the history of philosophy as much as through the history of conquest. He sent for a scholar named Aristotle, a man whose own teacher had been Plato, and whose teacher had in turn been Socrates, a direct intellectual lineage stretching back to the very origins of Greek philosophical inquiry. Aristotle had studied at Plato's academy in Athens for nearly 20 years, and by the time Philip summoned him, he had already begun developing his own distinct approach to understanding the natural world, ethics, politics, logic, and the arts, an approach that would eventually influence virtually every field of Western intellectual life for the next 2,000 years. Why would Philip, a king consumed by war and conquest, invest so heavily in bringing a philosopher to tutor his son? Partly, this reflected genuine Macedonian royal tradition. Earlier kings had also employed Greek tutors and intellectuals, eager to demonstrate that Macedon, despite southern Greek prejudice against it, belonged fully within the cultural world of Hellenic civilization, but it also reflected Philip's clear understanding that ruling an empire, should his ambitions succeed, would require more than martial skill alone. A ruler needed to understand rhetoric, to reason clearly, to grasp the natural sciences, medicine, ethics and governance. Philip wanted his son prepared not simply to conquer a world, but potentially to govern one. The setting Philip chose for this education was itself remarkable, and worth picturing clearly. Rather than educating Alexander within the noise and distraction of the royal court at Pella, Philip established the school at a place called Mieza, a quiet retreat some distance from the capital, centered around a sanctuary dedicated to the nymphs, set among gardens, covered walkways and shaded groves. Imagine the scene. A group of teenage boys, the sons of Macedonian nobility, gathered alongside the young prince, walking slow, contemplative circuits through gardens and colonnades, while Aristotle spoke, questioned, and guided their thinking, not through rigid lecture alone, but through the kind of walking dialogue that had also characterized Aristotle's own teaching methods in Athens. For roughly 3 years, from around the time Alexander turned 13 until he was about 16, this remarkable education continued. Aristotle taught a broad curriculum touching on logic, rhetoric, poetry, politics, ethics, biology, medicine, and the natural sciences as they were understood at the time. He is said to have prepared a special annotated copy of Homer's Iliad for his royal student, and this text became one of Alexander's most treasured possessions for the rest of his life. He reportedly kept it beneath his pillow during his later military campaigns, alongside a dagger, as though the epic poem of Achilles and the Trojan War were as essential a tool of leadership as any weapon. This connection to Homer's Iliad deserves particular attention because it reveals something important about how Alexander came to understand himself and his own destiny. The poem tells the story of Achilles, the greatest warrior of the Greek forces at Troy, a man offered a stark choice by the gods, a long, comfortable, but ultimately unremembered life, or a short life blazing with glory that would be sung and remembered for all future generations. Achilles chose glory. Alexander, raised on this story from childhood, appears to have absorbed its central values completely. The idea that a life measured by fame, honor, and extraordinary achievement was worth more than a long, safe, ordinary existence. Ancient sources tell us Alexander considered himself descended from Achilles through his mother's side of the family, tracing lineage back through the royal house of Epirus, and he seems to have modelled aspects of his own self-image quite deliberately on this legendary hero. Aristotle's influence extended into other areas as well. His interest in biology and natural science appears to have shaped Alexander's own curiosity about the natural world. Throughout his later campaigns, Alexander would send specimens of unusual plants and animals back to Aristotle in Greece, contributing genuinely to the philosopher's scientific research, even while marching an army across unfamiliar continents. This detail is worth pausing on quietly. Even in the middle of conquest, some part of Alexander retained the curious, inquiring mind that Aristotle had nurtured at Mieza, a genuine fascination with the world beyond simply the desire to control it. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine that Aristotle's teachings simply produced a gentle philosopher king. Aristotle held views, common among educated Greeks of his time, that placed Greek culture above others, and some ancient sources suggest he advised Alexander to treat Greeks as free citizens deserving respect, but to treat non-Greek peoples with something closer to the authority one might use towards subjects, or even, in the harshest interpretation, toward tools and animals. Alexander's later actions would, in some ways, follow this teaching, and in other striking ways, would move well beyond it. As his conquests progressed deep into Asia, Alexander increasingly adopted Persian customs, married into Persian and Central Asian royal families, and attempted, in ways that deeply troubled many of his own Macedonian officers, to blend Greek and non-Greek cultures together, rather than simply ruling one over the other. Whether this reflected a rejection of Aristotle's narrower teachings, or simply Alexander's own pragmatic recognition of what it would take to govern an empire of such staggering size and diversity, remains one of the fascinating open questions historians continue to debate. By the time Alexander turned 16, his formal education with Aristotle came to its natural end. Philip needed to return to campaigning, and needed, increasingly, a son capable of sharing the burdens of rule. The philosopher had done his work. What remained now was to test the prince against the world itself. In the year 340 before our era, when Alexander was just 16 years old, Philip departed Macedon to lay siege to the city of Byzantium, an important and heavily fortified city controlling the narrow strait that connected the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, a location of enormous strategic and commercial value, as grain ships from the fertile lands around the Black Sea passed through these waters to feed cities throughout the Greek world. Rather than leaving the kingdom in the hands of a trusted general or advisor during his absence, Philip made a decision that speaks volumes about his confidence in his teenage son. He appointed Alexander as regent, granting him the royal seal and full authority to govern Macedon in his father's absence. It did not take long for this authority to be tested. A Thracian tribe called the Maedi, sensing an opportunity while the king was occupied elsewhere, rose in revolt along Macedon's northeastern frontier. Rather than waiting for his father's return, or relying entirely on his father's generals, 16-year-old Alexander gathered a Macedonian force and marched against them himself. The campaign was swift and decisive. Alexander defeated the Maedi, drove them from their territory, and, in a gesture that reveals much about the ambitions already stirring in this teenager's mind, founded a new city on the site of their settlement, populating it with a mixed community of Greeks and locals, and naming it after himself, Alexandropolis, the city of Alexander. This was no small symbolic act. Founding cities was traditionally the prerogative of kings and conquerors of considerable stature, and here was a 16-year-old boy already claiming that particular mark of power and permanence, a habit he would repeat on a far grander scale throughout Asia in the years to come, ultimately founding numerous cities that carried his name across 3 continents. This episode reveals a pattern that would define Alexander's entire life, an almost restless eagerness to prove himself, to act rather than wait, to seize opportunities for glory and legacy wherever they appeared, however young or inexperienced he might technically be. Where another regent might have simply held the kingdom steady until the king's return, Alexander used the opportunity to expand Macedonian territory and stake his own claim to the kind of achievement that Macedonian culture prized above nearly everything else. Philip, upon his return from the Byzantium campaign, which itself did not go entirely as planned, as the siege ultimately failed when Athenian and other Greek naval forces intervened to relieve the city, found a son who had proven himself capable of independent command at an age when most young men were still finishing their formal education. It must have been, in equal measure, a source of pride and perhaps the faintest quiet flicker of unease. A son this capable, this early, was an asset beyond measure on the battlefield. But in the fierce, competitive, sometimes lethal politics of the Macedonian court, a capable and popular son could also eventually become a rival. For now, though, father and son had stood together, and the greatest test of their partnership, and of the reformed Macedonian army Philip had spent 2 decades building, still lay ahead. A confrontation with the combined might of Athens and Thebes, the 2 most powerful city-states remaining in southern Greece, on a plain called Chaeronea. By the late 340s before our era, Philip's steady expansion of Macedonian power had become impossible for the southern Greek city-states to ignore any longer. City by city, region by region, Macedon had absorbed territory, formed alliances, and extended its influence southward, and many in Athens in particular had come to see this growing power as an existential threat to Greek independence and the traditional way of life the city-states had known for centuries. At the heart of the Athenian resistance to Philip stood a remarkable orator named Demosthenes, whose speeches against Macedonian expansion, passionate, urgent, and delivered with such famous rhetorical force that his name became, for centuries afterward, essentially synonymous with the art of persuasive public speaking, helped rally Athens toward war. Demosthenes argued again and again before the Athenian assembly that Philip represented a fundamentally different kind of threat than the rivalries Greek cities had traditionally fought among themselves, a threat to the very independence and freedom that Greek city-state culture had prized since the days of the wars against Persia over a century earlier. Eventually, Athens found an unlikely ally in its old rival Thebes. For generations, Athens and Thebes had been bitter enemies, fighting one another as often as they fought outside threats. and the fact that Philip's expansion drove these two proud, historically hostile cities into alliance against him tells us something important about how seriously the southern Greek world had come to regard the Macedonian threat. In the summer of 338 before our era, the armies met on a plain near the small town of Charonia in Boeotia, the region surrounding Thebes. On one side stood the combined forces of Athens, Thebes, and several smaller allied city-states, including, among the Theban contingent, an elite unit called the Sacred Band, 300 hand-picked warriors organized into pairs of devoted companions, a unit that had, over the preceding decades, developed a reputation as nearly unbeatable in close combat, having never been defeated in battle. On the other side stood Philip's Macedonian army, and here our story turns once again to Alexander, now 18 years old. Given command of the left wing of his father's forces, an extraordinary responsibility for someone so young, though by this point, following his successful campaign against the Maadi, Alexander had already demonstrated the kind of battlefield instinct that justified such trust. The details of the battle itself, as recorded by ancient historians, though incomplete in places, suggest a carefully calculated Macedonian strategy. Philip, commanding the right wing personally, appears to have deliberately allowed his infantry to fall back in a controlled, gradual retreat, drawing the eager, less experienced Athenian forces forward in pursuit, stretching and disordering their formation as they advanced, confident that they were pushing the Macedonians into retreat. This created an opening as the Athenian line advanced, and in doing so, inevitably created gaps and disorder in the broader allied battle line. Alexander, commanding the Macedonian cavalry on the left flank, led a decisive charge directly into this weakened position, striking, according to most ancient accounts, at the position held by the Theban Sacred Band itself. What followed was, by every ancient account, one of the most significant military engagements in Greek history, and one with a particularly poignant human dimension that has echoed through the centuries since. The Sacred Band, true to their reputation and their bonds of loyalty to one another, refused to break formation or retreat, even as the battle turned decisively against them. They fought and died largely where they stood, holding their position to the last, rather than abandoning their companions to save themselves. When the battle ended, some 254 members of this legendary 300-man unit lay dead on the field, their bodies later found, according to ancient accounts, still largely in formation, having refused to break ranks even in death. The victory at Charonia proved decisive and, in a very real sense, historically final. Athens and Thebes, the two great powers of southern Greece, were thoroughly defeated. Philip treated the two cities quite differently in the aftermath, revealing his characteristic blend of calculated cruelty and calculated mercy. Thebes, which had betrayed an earlier alliance with Philip to join Athens, was punished harshly. A Macedonian garrison was installed within the city, and the leaders of the anti-Macedonian faction there were executed or exiled. Athens, by contrast, received surprisingly gentle treatment, retaining its independence, its democratic institutions, and even its fleet, largely because Philip recognized the value of Athenian goodwill, culture, and naval power for his broader ambitions, which by this point had begun to extend far beyond Greece itself, toward the vast Persian Empire across the Aegean Sea. In the following year, Philip convened a congress of Greek states at Corinth, where the assembled cities, with the notable exception of Sparta, which refused to participate, formally recognized Macedonian leadership over a new alliance known to modern historians as the League of Corinth. Philip was declared the leader, or hegemon, of this league, and crucially, the league formally declared war against the Persian Empire, ostensibly in retaliation for Persia's invasion of Greece over a century earlier, though the practical ambitions driving this declaration extended well beyond old grievances toward new opportunities for conquest, wealth, and glory. Philip began preparing an advance force to cross into Asia Minor, the beginning of what he clearly intended to be a much larger campaign against Persia itself, a campaign he expected to lead personally, with his talented, battle-tested son at his side as a trusted commander. He would never get the chance. Before we reach the shattering event that would end Philip's life and thrust Alexander onto the throne years earlier than anyone had planned, we must sit for a moment with the growing tensions inside the Macedonian royal family, tensions that had been building quietly for years, and that would erupt catastrophically, at the worst possible moment. At the heart of this conflict stood the deeply complicated relationship between Philip, Olympias, and their son. As we have already discussed, Macedonian royal custom permitted kings to take multiple wives, generally for reasons of political alliance rather than romantic preference alone, and Philip had, over the years, married several times in addition to Olympias. For most of Alexander's youth, this arrangement, however uncomfortable, had not directly threatened his position as Philip's heir apparent. His combination of Philip's paternal favour, his own demonstrated capability, and Olympias' fierce advocacy on his behalf had kept his path to the throne relatively secure. This changed around the year 337 before our era, when Philip took a new wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, from an old and prestigious Macedonian family, quite distinct from her famous Egyptian namesake, who would appear in history nearly 3 centuries later. Unlike Philip's earlier marriages, largely made for reasons of foreign diplomacy with neighbouring kingdoms and tribes, this marriage was to a woman fully Macedonian by blood on both sides of her family, and this detail mattered enormously in a court where questions of legitimacy, ancestry, and pure Macedonian bloodline carried real political weight. The wedding feast, as later recorded by ancient historians, became the setting for a dramatic and consequential confrontation. Cleopatra's uncle, a Macedonian nobleman named Attalus, rose during the festivities, having drunk deeply of the wine flowing freely at the celebration, and offered a toast expressing hope that this new marriage would produce a legitimate heir for Macedon, a phrase that struck Alexander, present at the feast, as a direct insult to his own legitimacy and his mother's honour, given that Olympias, though a princess in her own right from Epirus, was not ethnically Macedonian. Alexander, furious, is said to have thrown his cup at Attalus, shouting some version of the challenge. "Am I a bastard then?" Philip, drunk himself and equally enraged by his son's outburst, at what was meant to be a celebratory occasion, reportedly rose from his seat, drew his sword, and lunged toward his own son, only to trip and fall, drunk and off balance, before reaching him. Alexander, watching his father sprawled on the floor, is said to have delivered one of the most cutting remarks recorded from his youth, observing dryly that here was a man who intended to cross from Europe into Asia to conquer an empire, yet could not even cross safely from one couch to another. The scene, whether recorded with complete accuracy or embellished somewhat by later historians eager to foreshadow the family's tragic future, captures a real and consequential rupture. Shortly afterward, Alexander and his mother Olympias left the Macedonian court entirely. Olympias returned to her homeland of Epirus, to the court of her brother, while Alexander travelled north into Illyria among people who had once been Macedon's enemies, placing himself, quite deliberately and pointedly, beyond his father's immediate authority and protection. This estrangement did not last indefinitely. Diplomatic efforts, including mediation by a family friend, eventually brought about a reconciliation, and Alexander returned to the Macedonian court. But the underlying tensions the episode revealed, questions about Alexander's legitimacy, the ambitions of rival factions within the court, and the deep, unresolved resentment simmering between Olympias and Philip's new marriage did not simply disappear. They remained quietly beneath the surface of court life, waiting for another spark. That spark arrived with shocking violent finality in the autumn of 336 before our era. Philip had chosen the ancient city of Aigai, the traditional ceremonial capital of Macedon and burial place of its kings, as the setting for an event of enormous political significance. The wedding of his daughter, also named Cleopatra, to the king of Epirus, Olympias' own brother, a marriage designed to formally cement the reconciliation between the two royal houses, and to celebrate, publicly and grandly, before delegates and dignitaries gathered from across the Greek world, the power and stability of Philip's reign at the very height of his success. The celebrations were, by every surviving account, magnificent and carefully staged for maximum political effect. Games, feasts and theatrical performances filled several days of festivities. On the morning, the wedding procession was to enter the theatre at Aigai for a grand public ceremony. Philip arranged an especially striking piece of political theatre of his own. He ordered that he should walk into the theatre alone, without his customary bodyguard immediately surrounding him, a deliberate gesture meant to demonstrate to the assembled Greek dignitaries his confidence, his security, and the peaceful stability of his rule. proof, in a sense, that here was a king so secure in the loyalty of his people that he needed no visible protection at all. As Philip walked through the entrance passage toward the theatre, ahead of the formal procession, a young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias, who served among Philip's own bodyguard, stepped forward and stabbed him with a dagger, killing him almost instantly. Pausanias attempted to flee the scene, running toward horses that had reportedly been left waiting nearby for his escape, but he was pursued and killed on the spot by several of Philip's other bodyguards before he could be questioned about who, if anyone, had assisted or directed the assassination. And here, dear listener, we arrive at one of the great unresolved mysteries of ancient history, a mystery that has occupied historians for over 2,000 years, and one which, honestly and carefully, we must acknowledge we cannot fully solve tonight, or perhaps ever. The ancient sources offer several possible explanations for Pausanias' motive, and several possible theories about who else might have been involved. One account suggests a deeply personal motive, that Pausanias had suffered a serious personal grievance connected to Attalus, the same nobleman involved in the earlier wedding feast confrontation, and that Philip had failed to properly address or punish this grievance, leaving Pausanias humiliated and seeking revenge through violence against the king himself, whom he blamed for the lack of justice. But other ancient writers, and many modern historians studying the event, have suggested that Pausanias may not have acted entirely alone, or entirely for personal reasons. Suspicion in the aftermath fell in several directions. Some pointed toward Persian involvement, suggesting the Persian king, aware of Philip's plans to invade his empire, might have sought to eliminate the threat before it could properly begin. Others, more troublingly, have pointed closer to home, toward Olympias herself, given her known resentment toward Philip following his marriage to Cleopatra, and even, in the most extreme and controversial theories, toward Alexander himself, who stood to gain the throne immediately, and who had, as we have seen, experienced serious conflict with his father in the recent past. We must be careful here, and honest with the uncertainty that surrounds this question. There is no reliable, direct evidence proving that either Olympias or Alexander orchestrated Philip's murder, and many historians consider it more likely that Pausanias acted primarily from personal motives, with the broader political benefits to Alexander and Olympias simply being a consequence of the assassination rather than its true cause. Ancient sources do report, however, that Olympias treated Pausanias' corpse with peculiar reverence after his death, and that she may have arranged the elimination of other individuals connected to the assassination in the months that followed, details that have fueled suspicion for over 2,000 years without ever providing definitive proof. What we can say with confidence is this: Philip II of Macedon, the king who had rebuilt a broken kingdom into the dominant power of the Greek world, who had spent over 2 decades forging the army, the wealth, and the diplomatic alliances that would make possible everything his son achieved afterward, was dead at approximately the age of 46, struck down at the very moment of his greatest triumph on the eve of the Persian campaign he had spent years preparing. And in the chaos and uncertainty of that autumn morning at Aigai, a 20-year-old man named Alexander found himself, suddenly and violently, king of Macedon. The days and weeks immediately following Philip's assassination were, by any measure, among the most dangerous of Alexander's entire life, more dangerous in some ways than many of the battles that would later make him famous, because the threats he faced now came not from foreign armies on distant battlefields, but from within his own court, his own family, and his own kingdom. A new Macedonian king, however capable, was never automatically secure upon his father's death. Macedonian history was littered with examples of kings overthrown, assassinated, or challenged by rival claimants within months or even weeks of taking the throne, particularly when that succession came suddenly and violently, as Alexander's had. Several potential rivals existed for the throne, including other members of the extended royal family, and Alexander understood, with the same clear-eyed pragmatism his father had shown throughout his own reign, that hesitation now could prove fatal. Alexander moved swiftly and, by the standards of the time, ruthlessly to secure his position. He ordered the execution of several potential rival claimants to the throne, including cousins with plausible royal blood claims who might otherwise have become the focus of rebellion or foreign-backed challenges to his rule. He also moved against Attalus, the uncle of Philip's final wife Cleopatra, who commanded Macedonian forces already stationed in Asia Minor as the advance guard for the planned Persian campaign. A dangerous potential rival, given his military command and his family's now complicated relationship to the throne. Attalus was killed on Alexander's orders, eliminating another significant threat to his position. The fate of Cleopatra herself, Philip's final wife, and her infant children by Philip, remains a particularly dark and disputed episode. Ancient sources suggest that Olympias, acting either with Alexander's knowledge or independently in the chaotic aftermath of Philip's death, arranged for Cleopatra and her child or children to be killed, eliminating any possibility that they might later become rallying points for factions opposed to Alexander's rule. This was brutal, even by the standards of ancient dynastic politics, and it reveals something important about the ruthless calculations required to survive, let alone thrive, in the world of Macedonian royal succession. Beyond these internal threats, Alexander also faced immediate challenges to Macedonian authority across the wider region his father had spent decades subduing. Word of Philip's death spread quickly, and several of the peoples and city-states that had submitted to Macedonian power reconsidered their position, wondering whether this young, unproven king could hold together the empire his father had built, or whether this moment of transition represented an opportunity to reclaim their independence. To the north, tribes along Macedon's frontier stirred with renewed hopes of throwing off Macedonian influence. To the south, several Greek city-states, Thebes and Athens prominent among them, began quietly considering whether Philip's death offered a chance to break free from the League of Corinth and Macedonian hegemony that had been imposed upon them following Chaeronea. Alexander responded with the same combination of speed, boldness, and calculated force that had characterized his father's methods, but executed now with an urgency befitting a young ruler who understood he had no margin for error. He marched south first, moving so quickly with his forces that the Greek city-states, still debating and calculating their response to Philip's death, found a Macedonian army already at their gates before they had fully organized any resistance. Thessaly submitted without significant fighting. At Thermopylae, the famous mountain pass where Spartan forces had made their legendary last stand against Persian invaders over a century earlier, Alexander secured passage south into central Greece. At Corinth, Alexander convened the assembled Greek states, much as his father had done, and secured formal recognition as the new hegemon of the League of Corinth, inheriting his father's position of leadership over the alliance and, crucially, its formal declaration of war against Persia. It was here, according to a famous and much-loved anecdote recorded by later historians, that Alexander is said to have encountered the philosopher Diogenes, a famous ascetic thinker who lived with deliberate simplicity, rejecting material possessions and conventional social ambitions entirely. The story goes that Alexander, curious about this philosopher whose reputation had reached even the royal court, visited Diogenes as he lay resting in the sunlight and offered to grant him any favour he wished, given Alexander's newfound power and authority. Diogenes, unimpressed by kings, generals, or conquerors, is said to have simply replied that he wished for only one thing, that Alexander would move slightly to one side, as he was currently blocking the sunlight. Alexander, rather than taking offence at this dismissive response from a man who clearly valued nothing that Alexander had to offer, is said to have remarked to his companions afterward that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. A telling glimpse into a young king who, even amid his own rapidly consolidating power, retained some genuine respect for a philosophy of life entirely different from his own restless ambition. But the deepest test of Alexander's authority, as the new king of Macedon, still lay ahead, and it would come not from diplomacy or clever political theatre, but from open rebellion, and it would end in one of the most controversial and consequential decisions of his entire reign. While Alexander turned his attention briefly northward, campaigning against tribes along the Danube frontier and the fierce Illyrian peoples to the west, securing, much as his father had done years earlier, the northern borders of the kingdom before any campaign against Persia could safely proceed. a rumor spread through Greece that would prove catastrophic for one of its greatest cities. Word reached Thebes that Alexander had been killed during his northern campaigns. We cannot know with certainty how this rumor began, whether through genuine confusion following a difficult battle, or through deliberate misinformation spread by those hoping to incite rebellion against Macedonian rule. But the effect was immediate and dramatic. Thebes, still resentful of the Macedonian garrison installed within its walls following Chaeronea, and encouraged by exiled anti-Macedonian political leaders who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, rose in open revolt, besieging the Macedonian garrisons stationed within the city's own citadel. The rumour of Alexander's death, however, proved entirely false. Alexander was very much alive, and upon hearing news of the Theban revolt, he marched his army south with extraordinary speed, covering the distance from the northern frontier to Thebes itself in a remarkably short span of time. A demonstration, once again, of the speed and decisiveness that would characterize his military career throughout the years to come. Thebes, faced with a sudden and unwelcome reality that the king they had believed dead was in fact alive and standing outside their walls with his army, was offered an opportunity to negotiate and surrender peacefully, avoiding the violence that a siege and assault would inevitably bring. But encouraged by their exiled political leaders and perhaps genuinely believing that other Greek city-states might yet come to their aid, the Thebans refused, and the city prepared instead for a final confrontation. What followed proved to be one of the most severe and consequential punishments Alexander would inflict throughout his entire career, and it stands, even today, as one of the most debated and controversial decisions of his reign. After a hard-fought battle in which Macedonian forces, aided by troops from other Greek states that held long-standing grievances against Theban dominance in the region, breached the city's defences, Alexander made the decision to destroy Thebes almost entirely. The city's buildings were razed to the ground, with the notable exception of temples to the gods, and the house once belonging to the poet Pindar, whom Alexander apparently held in particular reverence for his literary achievements centuries earlier. A curious, telling detail that reveals something of Alexander's own complicated relationship with culture and destruction existing simultaneously within the same brutal campaign. The surviving population of the city, numbering many thousands of men, women and children, was sold into slavery, their homes and their ancient storied city reduced to rubble. The destruction of Thebes sent shockwaves throughout the Greek world. This was one of the great, ancient cities of Greek civilization, a city with deep roots in Greek mythology and history, associated with legendary figures like Oedipus and Heracles, a city that had, within living memory, been powerful enough to defeat even Sparta in open battle. Its sudden, near-total destruction served as an unmistakable warning to every other Greek city-state that might be considering rebellion against Macedonian authority. While Alexander turned his attention toward Persia, resistance would be met with absolute, devastating consequences. The strategy, brutal as it was, proved effective in the short term. No other major Greek city-state rose in rebellion during Alexander's subsequent absence on his Persian campaign. Athens, which had briefly considered supporting the Theban revolt, quickly reaffirmed its submission and sent envoys seeking Alexander's forgiveness for even having entertained the possibility of supporting Thebes. Alexander, perhaps recognizing the diplomatic and cultural value of Athens in ways that made the calculation different from Thebes' fate, accepted this submission and did not extend similar destruction to Athens itself. We should sit for a moment with the discomfort this episode rightly creates. The destruction of Thebes represents one of the darker chapters in Alexander's story, a stark reminder that the same young man capable of tears at his father's pride, of curiosity about philosophy, of genuine scientific interest in the natural world, was equally capable of ordering the near-total annihilation of an ancient and storied city when calculation demanded it. This duality, brilliance and brutality existing within the same person, sometimes within the same decision, will recur throughout the remainder of our story, and it is worth remembering as we continue, rather than smoothing away into a simpler, more comfortable narrative than the historical record actually supports. With Greece now thoroughly secured through a combination of diplomacy, calculated mercy, and devastating punishment where resistance had appeared, Alexander could finally turn his full attention toward the campaign his father had spent years preparing and had died before ever beginning. The invasion of the vast Persian Empire, the greatest and wealthiest power the known world had ever seen. Before we follow Alexander across the waters that separated Europe from Asia, let us pause gently and consider the scale of what he was about to attempt, because it is easy, with the benefit of hindsight and the knowledge of how the story eventually unfolds, to forget just how audacious, even reckless, this undertaking appeared to many observers at the time. The Persian Empire, ruled at this point by King Darius III, stretched from the Aegean coast of Asia Minor in the west to the Indus River Valley in the east, encompassing Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau and vast stretches of Central Asia, a territory so enormous that it would have taken months simply to travel from one end to the other, home to tens of millions of people speaking dozens of languages, practicing dozens of religions, governed through a sophisticated administrative system of regional governors called satraps, connected by an extensive network of royal roads that allowed messages and administrators to move across the empire with remarkable speed for the ancient world. Against this staggering imperial machine, Alexander prepared to march with an army numbering, according to most ancient estimates, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 soldiers, a force that, however excellent in training and discipline, represented an almost absurdly small fraction of the manpower and resources that Persia could theoretically bring to bear against him, should the full weight of the empire's resources be properly mobilized. Why, then, did Alexander believe this campaign could succeed where a more cautious ruler might have hesitated indefinitely? Several factors combined to shape his confidence, some rooted in careful calculation, others perhaps rooted in something closer to the restless, glory-seeking temperament that had defined him since childhood, since the story of Bucephalus, since his devotion to the example of Achilles. Militarily, Alexander inherited from his father not just an army, but a truly exceptional one. Professional soldiers who had trained together for years, developed under a military system specifically designed to combine disciplined infantry formations with devastating cavalry charges, led by veteran generals who had served under Philip through decades of successful campaigning. This was not a hastily assembled force of citizen soldiers, as many Greek and Persian armies still substantially were, but something closer to a professional standing military machine, the likes of which the ancient Mediterranean world had rarely seen. Financially, the campaign rested on shakier ground than the army's battlefield capabilities might suggest. Macedon's treasury, despite the wealth Philip had accumulated through the gold and silver mines of Thrace, was not limitless, and ancient sources suggest Alexander departed for Persia carrying significant debts, having borrowed heavily to fund the initial phase of the campaign, essentially betting that early victories and the seizure of Persian wealth and territory would fund the campaign's continuation. This was, in a very real sense, an invasion that had to succeed quickly and decisively, because there was no realistic possibility of sustaining a long, grinding war of attrition against an empire with Persia's vastly superior resources. Before departing, Alexander attended to several matters of both practical and symbolic importance. He appointed a trusted and experienced general named Antipater as regent, to govern Macedon and manage Greek affairs during his absence, a role Antipater would in fact hold for many years, as Alexander's campaign extended far longer and far farther than anyone initially anticipated. He also made a point of distributing significant portions of his own personal property and royal estates among his closest companions and officers before departing, and when asked what he had kept for himself, he is said to have replied simply, "My hopes," a small, revealing anecdote suggesting a young king entirely willing to stake everything, materially and personally, on the success of the venture ahead. Alexander also made a symbolically significant visit to the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred and revered site of prophecy in the entire Greek world, seeking confirmation and blessing for the campaign ahead. According to the story, he arrived on a day when the oracle was not scheduled to give prophecies, and when the priestess refused to perform the ritual, Alexander is said to have physically dragged her toward the sacred tripod where prophecies were traditionally delivered, at which point she reportedly exclaimed, in evident exasperation, that he was invincible. an utterance Alexander immediately claimed as the prophecy he had sought, regardless of the rather unusual circumstances under which it had been extracted from her. Finally, in the spring of 334 before our era, Alexander led his army north and east from Macedon, through Thrace, toward the narrow strait known as the Hellespont, the ancient name for what is today called the Dardanelles, the narrow body of water separating the European and Asian continents, a crossing point steeped in legend and historical memory. It was here, over a century earlier, that the Persian king Xerxes had built a bridge of boats to march his own massive invasion force in the opposite direction, into Greece, an invasion that Greek forces, against tremendous odds, had eventually repelled. And it was here, according to the ancient epics Alexander had studied so devotedly under Aristotle's guidance, that the Greek forces of the Trojan War, led by Achilles and Agamemnon, had once crossed these same waters to lay siege to the city of Troy, standing on the Asian shore just beyond. As his fleet prepared to make the crossing, Alexander performed a series of deliberate, symbolic gestures that reveal, with striking clarity, exactly how he understood the significance of the moment. He steered his own ship personally across the strait, and upon reaching the midpoint of the crossing, he sacrificed a bull to Poseidon, god of the sea, and poured a libation from a golden cup into the waters below, honouring the sea nymphs associated with these waters in ancient mythology. Upon reaching the Asian shore, he is said to have been the first to leap from his ship onto the land, hurling his spear into the earth and declaring that he received all of Asia as territory won by the spear, a formal, almost ritualistic claim of conquest before a single battle against Persian forces had even been fought. He then travelled, quite deliberately, to the site of ancient Troy itself, where he made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles, running a ceremonial race around the tomb in the ancient Greek tradition of honouring fallen heroes, and exchanged his own armour for a shield reportedly dating back to the Trojan War itself, a shield he would carry with him, according to ancient accounts, throughout his subsequent campaigns as a treasured, symbolic connection to the heroic age he had been raised to emulate since childhood. Standing on the shore of Asia, 22 years old, carrying his father's army, his father's unfinished ambitions, an enormous burden of debt, and a mind shaped since childhood by his mother's conviction of divine destiny and his tutor's rigorous philosophical training, Alexander looked eastward toward an empire whose true size and complexity he could barely have imagined. However carefully his scouts and advisors had tried to prepare him, he could not have known, standing there on that shore in the spring of 334 before our era, just how far this journey would ultimately carry him. Through the river valleys of Asia Minor, into the deserts of Egypt, across the heart of the Persian Empire itself, over mountain passes into Central Asia, and eventually into the Indian subcontinent, further east than any Greek army had ever marched, further than most Greeks even believed the inhabited world extended. The spear was still standing in the soil of Asia when Alexander turned back toward his waiting army, and the campaign that would occupy the rest of his life, and end it, truly began. Let your body settle again into the same stillness it found before. We are simply continuing the walk, not starting a new one. The young king is still 22. His father's veteran officers are still watching him closely, wondering whether the confidence he carries is wisdom or simply youth that has not yet met its limit. The army that crossed the Hellespont with him numbers somewhere near 40,000 men, and ahead of them, spreading out across 3 continents, lies an empire so vast that most of the soldiers marching behind Alexander that spring could not have named all the lands it contained. We left him at the edge of the sea. Let us follow him now inland. Alexander's route inland from the coast brought his army, within weeks of the crossing, to the banks of a modest river called the Granicus, in the region of Asia Minor known as Phrygia. It was here that Persian forces, commanded by a coalition of regional satraps, the governors who administered the empire's provinces, along with a substantial force of Greek mercenaries serving under a commander named Memnon of Rhodes, chose to make their first stand against the Macedonian invasion. It is worth pausing here to understand something about how Persia's vast empire actually functioned, because it explains a great deal about the campaign to come. The Persian king did not rule through a single centralized standing army stationed permanently at the frontier. Instead, the empire depended on regional satraps, each governing enormous territories, each capable of raising substantial local forces when threatened, but each also somewhat independent, sometimes rivalrous, and not always swift to coordinate with one another or with the distant royal court. This meant that Alexander's invasion, in its earliest phase, faced not the full, unified might of Persia, but rather a regional response, assembled quickly by the satraps whose territories lay closest to the coast. The battle at the Granicus was, by several ancient accounts, a close and genuinely dangerous encounter for Alexander personally, despite the eventual Macedonian victory. The Persian cavalry held the far bank of the river, a defensive position that should, by conventional military logic, have favoured the defenders considerably, since attacking cavalry across a river against waiting horsemen on the opposite bank was widely considered a poor tactical choice. Alexander's own officers, according to the historian Arian, advised caution, suggesting a delay until a more favourable crossing point or moment could be found. Alexander characteristically chose to attack immediately. He led the cavalry charge across the river himself, in full view of his own army, a decision that placed him personally at the very front of the most dangerous fighting, almost from the opening moments of the battle. In the chaotic combat that followed on the riverbank, Alexander came close to death. A Persian nobleman struck at his head with a battle-axe, and ancient sources tell us that only the quick intervention of one of his companions, a veteran officer named Cletus, who cut down the attacker before the blow could land fully, saved Alexander's life in that critical instant. This detail deserves a moment of reflection, because it reveals something that will recur throughout Alexander's entire military career, again and again. Across a dozen battles over the following decade, he did not lead from behind. He did not direct his forces from a safe, elevated vantage point, watching the fighting unfold at a comfortable distance, as some ancient and many later commanders preferred to do. He rode, quite literally, at the front of his own cavalry charges, sharing every immediate danger with the soldiers he commanded. This was, in part, a deliberate leadership philosophy, rooted in the old Macedonian tradition that a king earned loyalty by fighting beside his men rather than simply commanding them from a distance. It was also, quite plainly, an enormous and recurring personal risk, one that would eventually catch up with him in serious wounds sustained across multiple later campaigns. The Macedonian victory at the Granicus proved decisive, and its aftermath revealed another important pattern in Alexander's approach to conquest. Rather than treating the Greek mercenaries captured after the battle as ordinary prisoners of war, Alexander had them treated with particular harshness, considering them traitors to the broader Greek cause he claimed to represent, since they had taken Persian pay to fight against a Greek-led invasion of Persia. Many were killed outright. The survivors were sent back to Macedon in chains, condemned to hard labour. This was calculated cruelty, intended to send a clear message to any other Greek soldiers who might consider selling their swords to Persian service in the campaigns still to come. With the regional Persian forces defeated, the coastal cities of Asia Minor began, one after another, to open their gates to Alexander, and here we see another crucial element of his broader strategy beginning to take shape, one that extended well beyond simple military conquest. As Alexander's army moved along the coast of Asia Minor, through cities that had, for generations, lived under Persian-appointed governors, he began presenting his campaign not merely as conquest, but as liberation, freeing Greek cities in Asia Minor from Persian rule, and restoring, in many cases, forms of local democratic self-governance that Persian administration had suppressed or restricted. This was, without question, effective and appealing propaganda, and it reflected genuine strategic calculation, since cities that welcomed Alexander as a liberator, rather than resisting him as a conqueror, required far less military effort to control, and could in fact provide resources, manpower, and secure supply lines for the ongoing campaign. But we should hold this framing with appropriate nuance, rather than accepting it entirely at face value. Alexander was not simply restoring independence for its own sake. He was replacing Persian administrative control with Macedonian oversight, appointing his own officials and garrison commanders even in cities where local democratic institutions were nominally restored. Liberation and conquest in this campaign were never entirely separate concepts. They existed together, woven through nearly every city Alexander's army approached. It was during this period, as the army moved into the interior region of Phrygia toward the city of Gordium, that one of the most famous and evocative stories of Alexander's entire career took place. A story so rich with symbolic meaning that it has echoed through language itself, giving us the modern phrase cutting the Gordian knot to describe solving a seemingly impossible problem through bold, decisive action, rather than patient, careful unraveling. In the city of Gordium, an ancient wagon stood on display, tied to its yoke by an extraordinarily complex knot of cornel bark, its ends carefully hidden within the tangle itself so that no one could see where the knot began or ended. Local legend held that this wagon had once belonged to Gordias, the legendary founder of the Phrygian royal line, and that an oracle had declared, generations earlier, that whoever succeeded in untying this impossibly complex knot would go on to rule all of Asia. Naturally, given both his own sense of destiny and the practical propaganda value of fulfilling such a prophecy in front of his assembled army, Alexander could not resist the challenge. According to the most popular version of the story, after examining the knot and finding no visible end to work with, Alexander drew his sword and simply sliced through it in a single stroke, declaring the prophecy fulfilled regardless of the unconventional method used to satisfy it. Some ancient sources offer a slightly different, gentler version of the tale, suggesting Alexander instead located the pin securing the yoke to the wagon pole and removed it, allowing the knot to be lifted away without the dramatic flourish of a sword stroke. We cannot know at this distance in time which version, if either precisely, reflects what actually happened at Gordium that day, but it hardly matters for understanding Alexander's character. Whether by blade or by careful observation, the story that ancient writers chose to preserve and celebrate reveals exactly how contemporaries and near-contemporaries understood him. A man who, faced with problems others considered unsolvable through conventional means, found unconventional solutions, and who never doubted, even for a moment, that the solution he found was the correct and destined one. By the autumn of 333 before our era, roughly a year after crossing into Asia, Alexander's campaign had progressed steadily through Asia Minor, and Persian King Darius III had, by this point, grown fully alarmed by the scale of the threat this young Macedonian king represented. Rather than continuing to rely solely on regional satraps and mercenary commanders, Darius assembled a substantial royal army, gathering forces from across the empire's vast territories, and marched personally to confront Alexander in what would become one of the most significant battles of the entire campaign. Near the town of Issus, close to the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean coast. The circumstances of this confrontation reveal an interesting strategic miscalculation on Darius's part, one that ancient historians examined with considerable interest. Rather than waiting for Alexander's army in the broad, open plains of Syria to the south, where the Persian army's much greater numbers could be deployed to maximum advantage across a wide battlefield, Darius advanced his forces into a narrow coastal plain near Issus, a location that, ironically, favoured the smaller, more manoeuvrable Macedonian army considerably more than it favoured Persia's numerical superiority. Some ancient accounts suggest this occurred because Darius, moving to intercept what he believed was Alexander's route, inadvertently positioned his massive army in unfavourable terrain, while Alexander's forces had already moved past this location, forcing an unexpected confrontation that neither side had originally planned to fight in precisely this spot. Whatever the precise sequence of movements that led to this positioning, the result was a battle fought on ground, where Persia's likely numerical advantage. Ancient sources offer wildly varying and probably exaggerated estimates of the Persian army's size, ranging from tens of thousands to, in some clearly inflated accounts, several 100,000, could not be fully brought to bear, constrained as both armies were by the narrow strip of land between mountains and sea. The battle unfolded, once again, around the decisive impact of Alexander's cavalry charge, aimed directly at the position where Darius himself commanded from his elevated war chariot, surrounded by his royal guard. This was, in fact, a recurring and deliberate feature of Alexander's battlefield strategy against Persian forces throughout the campaign. Rather than simply attempting to defeat the largest possible portion of the enemy army through attrition, he consistently sought to strike directly at the Persian king's own position, understanding that Persian forces, structured heavily around personal loyalty to the king and his immediate command, tended to lose cohesion and morale rapidly if Darius himself appeared threatened or fled the field. This is precisely what occurred at Issus. As Alexander's cavalry drove toward the royal position, cutting through the defending forces around Darius's chariot, the Persian king, faced with the immediate danger of capture or death, abandoned his chariot, mounted a horse, and fled the battlefield, leaving much of his own army behind in considerable disarray. His flight triggered a broader collapse of Persian morale and formation across much of the battlefield, and the confrontation, which might otherwise have remained closely contested given Persia's numbers, turned into a decisive Macedonian victory. In the aftermath, Alexander's forces captured Darius's abandoned camp, along with, significantly, members of the Persian king's own family who had accompanied the royal court on campaign, including Darius's mother, his wife, and his children. This capture presented Alexander with both a remarkable strategic opportunity and a delicate diplomatic situation, and his handling of it reveals, once again, the careful, calculated blend of ruthlessness and deliberate magnanimity that characterized so much of his approach to conquest. Rather than treating the captured Persian royal women harshly as conquered enemies might conventionally expect, Alexander ordered that they be treated with considerable respect and dignity, housed according to their royal status, and assured of their safety. This was, without question, partly genuine. Ancient sources describe Alexander's evident personal courtesy toward Darius's mother, Sisigambis, who reportedly came to regard him with something approaching genuine maternal affection over the following years, remaining close to the Macedonian court even after her son's eventual death. But it was also shrewd, calculated policy. Alexander understood that his ultimate ambitions extended toward ruling the Persian Empire itself, not simply plundering and destroying it, and that this ambition would require the cooperation, or at least the resigned acceptance, of Persian nobility and administrative structures. Treating the royal family with visible respect, rather than cruelty, served this longer-term political purpose considerably better than vengeful mistreatment would have. Darius, having escaped the battlefield, sent envoys to Alexander in the following months, offering peace terms. Proposals that, in successive rounds of negotiation, grew progressively more generous, eventually offering Alexander a substantial ransom for his captured family, a formal alliance sealed through marriage to one of Darius's daughters, and control over all Persian territory west of the Euphrates River, essentially conceding everything Alexander had conquered thus far in exchange for peace and an end to further advance into the empire's heartland. Alexander refused these terms, each time with growing confidence. According to ancient accounts, when one of his most senior generals, Parmenion, suggested that he would accept such generous terms if he were Alexander, the young king reportedly replied that he, too, would accept them if he were Parmenion. It was a telling remark, revealing just how far Alexander's ambitions had already expanded beyond simply defeating Persia in a single decisive engagement or securing favourable territorial concessions. He intended, by this point in the campaign, nothing less than the complete conquest of the entire Persian Empire and the assumption of the Persian throne itself. Before pursuing that ultimate goal, however, Alexander turned his attention southward, along the eastern Mediterranean coast, toward a strategic objective that would prove one of the most difficult and demanding of his entire career: securing control of the coastline and its powerful naval cities, before any further advance deeper into the Persian heartland could safely proceed. Among the cities lining the eastern Mediterranean coast, none presented Alexander with a greater military challenge than the Phoenician city of Tyre, and the siege that followed deserves careful attention, both for its extraordinary difficulty and for what it reveals about Alexander's remarkable persistence when faced with genuine obstacles, rather than the relatively swift victories that had characterized much of the campaign until this point. Tyre held a highly unusual strategic position. Much of the city sat on an island roughly half a mile off the mainland coast, protected by substantial walls and a formidable navy, making it essentially immune to conventional land-based siege tactics that had proven effective against other coastal cities. When Alexander's envoys approached Tyre, requesting permission to make sacrifices at the city's temple to Melkart, a Phoenician deity the Greeks associated with their own Heracles, the Tyrians refused, unwilling to allow a foreign army, however celebrated its recent victories, direct access into their heavily fortified island city. This refusal set in motion one of the most remarkable engineering feats of the ancient world. Rather than abandoning the siege as impractical, given the absence of a substantial Macedonian navy capable of directly challenging Tyre's fleet, Alexander ordered the construction of a massive causeway built entirely from rubble, timber, and stone, extending outward from the mainland coast across the half-mile of open water, separating it from the island city. Picture the scale of this undertaking, sustained over many months of grueling labour. Soldiers and hired labourers hauled stone and timber from the ruins of the mainland settlement of Old Tyre, and from nearby forests, building the causeway forward, metre by metre, under near-constant harassment from Tyrian ships and archers stationed along the city walls, who launched fire arrows and other projectiles at the exposed workers whenever conditions allowed. As the causeway crept closer to the island, the water grew deeper, the construction more difficult, and Tyrian defenders grew more creative and more desperate in their efforts to disrupt the project, at one point sending a fireship packed with combustible material directly into the wooden siege towers Alexander had constructed at the causeway's leading edge, destroying much of the progress that had taken weeks to achieve. Alexander responded to these setbacks not with abandonment of the siege, but with escalating determination and resourcefulness. He gathered ships from cities along the coast that had already submitted to Macedonian control, along with vessels from the island kingdom of Cyprus, whose rulers, observing the shifting balance of power in the region, chose to defect from Persian allegiance and offer their considerable naval forces to Alexander's cause instead. With this assembled fleet, Alexander was finally able to challenge and largely neutralize Tyre's own navy, allowing the causeway construction and eventually a direct naval and land assault against the city's walls to proceed. The siege continued for approximately 7 months in total, an extraordinarily long engagement by the standards of Alexander's typically swift campaigns, and when the city finally fell in the summer of 332 before our era, the consequences for its population proved severe. Ancient accounts suggest that thousands of Tyrian defenders and citizens were killed in the final assault, and thousands more were sold into slavery, a punishment reminiscent, in its severity, of the earlier destruction of Thebes, and reflecting the same underlying logic, a demonstration to every other city that might consider prolonged resistance of the devastating consequences such resistance would ultimately bring. With Tyre subdued, Alexander's path south along the coast continued, meeting only brief further resistance at the city of Gaza, before opening into the ancient land of Egypt, a country that would receive Alexander very differently than the exhausted, embattled cities of the Levantine coast had. Egypt, unlike much of the territory Alexander had conquered thus far, had long chafed under Persian rule, having been incorporated into the Persian Empire only relatively recently, following a period of Egyptian independence, and having risen in periodic rebellion against Persian administration in the decades before Alexander's arrival. When the Macedonian army entered Egypt in the autumn of 332 before our era, they were greeted, by most ancient accounts, not as conquerors to be resisted, but nearly as liberators. The Persian satrap governing Egypt surrendered without significant resistance, and the Egyptian population, and particularly its influential priestly class, appeared largely receptive to this change in overlordship. Alexander understood, with characteristic political shrewdness, the importance of securing genuine legitimacy in the eyes of Egyptian religious and cultural tradition, rather than simply imposing foreign rule through military force alone. He travelled to the ancient city of Memphis, where he was formally received and, according to Egyptian religious custom, crowned as pharaoh, taking on the traditional religious titles associated with Egyptian kingship, and made sacrifices to the Egyptian gods, particularly the sacred bull deity Apis, in a manner that stood in deliberate, respectful contrast to the treatment Egyptian religious institutions had reportedly received under at least some periods of harsher Persian administration. It was during this period in Egypt that Alexander made a decision that would prove, in the long run, to be one of the most enduring legacies of his entire career, more lasting, in certain respects, than any of his military victories. Near the western edge of the Nile Delta, along a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a coastal lake, in a location he judged favourable for its natural harbour, its defensible position, and its potential to connect Egyptian trade with the broader Mediterranean world, Alexander founded a new city and gave it his own name, Alexandria. This was not, as we discussed earlier, an entirely new habit for him. He had, after all, founded Alexandropolis years earlier, during his brief campaign against the Maadi as a teenage regent. But this new foundation on the Egyptian coast would grow to become something far greater than that earlier, more modest settlement. Ancient sources describe Alexander personally involved in planning the city's layout, marking out the location of its main streets, its marketplace and its temples, using, according to one memorable but almost certainly embellished tradition, barley meal scattered on the ground to outline the city's boundaries when no chalk or other suitable marking material could immediately be found. An image, whether precisely accurate or not, that captures something true about the hands-on, immediate involvement Alexander brought to even the administrative and architectural dimensions of empire building, alongside his more famous military pursuits. Alexandria would go on, over the following centuries, to become one of the great intellectual and commercial centers of the entire ancient world, home to its famous library and museum, a city where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and eventually Roman cultures intermingled and produced extraordinary advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Alexander himself, of course, would never see this future flourishing. He departed Egypt not long after founding the city and never returned to it during his lifetime. But the choice to found it here, at this particular moment, reflects something important about how Alexander understood his own project, not simply as a military campaign of plunder and destruction, but as the deliberate creation of a new kind of interconnected world, joining Greek and non-Greek cultures together in cities designed to outlast any single conqueror's lifetime. While in Egypt, Alexander also undertook a journey that ancient sources treat with particular reverence and mystery. A difficult expedition across the desert to the remote oasis of Siwa, deep in the Libyan desert, home to an oracle of the Egyptian god Amun, whom the Greeks associated with their own supreme deity Zeus. The journey itself was arduous and, according to several ancient accounts, nearly disastrous. The small expedition reportedly became lost in the trackless desert at one point, saved, according to differing traditions, either by an unexpected rainfall that replenished their water supplies, or by ravens or snakes that appeared to guide them back toward the correct path. What occurred within the oracle's inner sanctuary at Siwa remains, appropriately for an experience explicitly understood by ancient people as sacred and secret, largely undisclosed in the surviving historical record. Alexander reportedly consulted the oracle privately, refusing to share the specific content of what he asked or what answer he received, even with his closest companions. But ancient writers, drawing on rumour, later reports, and the broader pattern of how Alexander subsequently spoke about his own identity, suggest that the oracle addressed him, or was interpreted by Alexander and his attendants as addressing him as the son of the god Amun, a pronouncement that dovetailed, whether by genuine spiritual conviction or calculated political interpretation, or perhaps some blend of both operating simultaneously within Alexander's own mind, with his mother Olympias' long-standing claims regarding his divine paternity through Zeus. We should hold this episode, like so much involving Alexander's relationship to questions of divinity, with careful, gentle uncertainty rather than firm conclusions. Did Alexander genuinely come to believe, from this point forward, that he possessed some form of divine parentage beyond his human father, Philip? Ancient sources disagree, and the surviving evidence permits multiple interpretations. What we can observe with more confidence is that Alexander increasingly, over the years following this Egyptian sojourn, allowed and even encouraged ambiguity about his own status to circulate, useful, certainly, as a tool of political authority across an empire whose diverse populations included cultures, particularly Egyptian and later Persian traditions, quite accustomed to according their rulers a degree of sacred or divine status that Greek political culture had traditionally reserved for the gods alone and had denied to even its greatest mortal rulers. With Egypt secured, and a new city already rising from its foundation stones along the Mediterranean coast, Alexander turned his army eastward once more, back toward Mesopotamia, and toward the final, decisive confrontation with Darius that both men understood, by this point, was now unavoidable. In the summer of 331 before our era, having spent nearly 2 years since the victory at Issus, Expanding his control across the eastern Mediterranean coast and Egypt, Alexander led his army east across the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, deep into the Mesopotamian heartland of the Persian Empire, toward a final confrontation that Darius, given ample time since his earlier defeat, had prepared for with considerable care. Darius had gathered, according to ancient accounts, whose numerical estimates should again be treated with appropriate skepticism, given the tendency of ancient historians toward exaggeration, an enormous army drawing soldiers and resources from across the full breadth of the Persian Empire, cavalry and infantry from Mesopotamia, from the Iranian plateau, from Bactria and other distant eastern provinces, along with a contingent of scythed chariots, war elephants brought from India, and other exotic elements intended to overwhelm the smaller Macedonian force through sheer scale and diversity of military capability. Crucially, learning from the tactical error at Issus that had constrained his numerical advantage within narrow terrain, Darius selected a broad, open plain near the village of Gaugamela, close to the ancient city of Nineveh, specifically because its flat, unobstructed ground would allow his full army, and particularly his numerically superior cavalry and his scythed chariots, to be deployed without the geographic constraints that had proven so costly in the previous battle. He reportedly had the ground itself leveled and cleared in places, ensuring the terrain would offer no unexpected advantage to Macedonian forces. Alexander, arriving with an army that most ancient sources suggest numbered somewhere around 40 to 47,000 men, considerably smaller than the Persian force arrayed against him, whatever its precise size, faced a genuine tactical puzzle in devising an approach to this battle. The open terrain that favoured Darius's larger numbers also created the real danger of being surrounded or outflanked on both sides simultaneously, a serious risk against an army so much larger than his own. His solution, as reconstructed by ancient historians from surviving accounts, involved an unusually sophisticated and flexible battle formation, extending additional forces at angles from his main battle line, specifically to guard against flanking maneuvers, while still maintaining enough concentrated striking power at key points to execute the kind of decisive cavalry charge that had proven so effective in his previous engagements against Persian forces. The battle itself unfolded across a long, complex day of fighting, involving multiple phases and shifting fortunes across different portions of the extended battle lines. At certain points, particularly on portions of the Macedonian left flank commanded by the veteran General Parmenion, Persian forces achieved genuine local successes, pressing hard against Macedonian positions and creating moments of real danger and uncertainty. But Alexander, once again commanding the decisive cavalry element personally, identified a gap that opened in the Persian line as their own formation shifted and stretched during the fighting, and led a charge directly toward Darius's position at the center of the Persian army, echoing the same fundamental strategy that had proven decisive at Issus years earlier. Once again, as the danger to his own person grew immediate and severe, Darius chose to abandon the battlefield rather than risk capture or death, fleeing eastward with a portion of his remaining forces. And once again, this flight triggered a broader collapse in Persian morale and cohesion across much of the battlefield, transforming what had been, in several sectors, a genuinely closely contested engagement into a decisive overall Macedonian victory. The Battle of Gaugamela effectively ended any realistic Persian hope of reversing Alexander's conquest through direct military confrontation. In the months that followed, the great Persian imperial capitals fell to Alexander's advancing forces in rapid succession. Babylon, one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world, opened its gates without resistance, its population reportedly welcoming Alexander's forces with considerable ceremony. Susa, another major administrative capital, yielded similarly, its Persian treasury, containing staggering quantities of accumulated gold and silver, falling entirely into Macedonian hands, and finally, decisively, resolving the financial pressures that had constrained Alexander's campaign since its very earliest days of borrowed funding. Then came Persepolis, the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the Persian Empire, the site of the great royal palace complex where Persian kings had, for generations, received tribute and homage from across their vast domains. The treasury seized at Persepolis proved even more staggering than that captured at Susa, representing, according to ancient estimates, Wealth accumulated across generations of Persian imperial taxation and tribute, and it was here at Persepolis that one of the more troubling and debated episodes of Alexander's campaign occurred. During an extended period of feasting and celebration, according to several ancient accounts, Alexander ordered, or at minimum allowed, following the urging of an Athenian courtesan named Thyes present at the festivities, who argued that burning the palace would fittingly avenge the earlier Persian destruction of Athenian temples during Xerxes' invasion of Greece over a century before, the burning of the magnificent royal palace complex at Persepolis. The palace burned, its treasures and much of its architectural grandeur reduced to ash and rubble. Ancient sources offer somewhat differing accounts of Alexander's own state of mind and level of premeditation regarding this decision. Some suggest a spontaneous, wine-fueled decision made in the heat of a celebratory feast. Others suggest a more calculated, deliberate act of political symbolism, meant to formally and dramatically signal the definitive end of the Persian imperial line, and Alexander's own assumption of that imperial mantle. Some later accounts even suggest Alexander expressed regret for the decision once the flames had taken hold and could no longer be controlled. We cannot know with full certainty which interpretation comes closest to the truth. What remains clear is that one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient Near Eastern world, a palace complex that had taken generations of Persian kings to construct and adorn, was lost in a single night, an act whose motivations remain debated by historians even now, over 2,000 years later. Darius himself, meanwhile, continuing his flight eastward, with a diminishing group of loyal followers, met an end that even his sworn enemy Alexander appears to have found genuinely troubling. As Alexander pursued him relentlessly across the Iranian plateau, several of Darius's own remaining satraps and commanders, led by a regional governor named Bessus, turned against their king, seizing him and eventually killing him rather than allowing him to fall alive into Macedonian hands, before Bessus himself fled further east, declaring himself the new Persian king. When Alexander's forces reached the scene, they found Darius already dead or dying, abandoned by the very officials who had once served him. Ancient sources describe Alexander's response with evident emotional weight. He reportedly covered Darius's body with his own cloak, and later arranged for the deceased Persian king to receive a proper royal burial according to Persian custom, at the traditional royal necropolis near Persepolis, alongside earlier Persian kings. This gesture, whether motivated by genuine respect for a defeated rival, careful political calculation aimed at legitimizing Alexander's own claim to the Persian throne as Darius's rightful successor and avenger, or some combination of both motives intertwined, marked, in a symbolic and practical sense, the formal end of the Achaemenid Persian Empire that had dominated the ancient Near East for over 2 centuries. Alexander was now, by any reasonable measure, master of the largest empire the world had yet known. He was 25 years old. It is worth pausing here, gently, before we follow Alexander further east into territories even more distant and unfamiliar than Persia's heartland, to consider how the young man who had crossed the Hellespont 3 years earlier was beginning, in ways both subtle and increasingly visible to those around him, to change. Ancient sources, particularly those drawing on accounts from Alexander's own Macedonian officers and companions, describe a growing tension within the Macedonian court during this period, centered on Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs, dress, and court ceremony. He began wearing elements of Persian royal attire, blending them with traditional Macedonian dress in ways that many of his own veteran officers, men who had served under his father and had marched with Alexander since the earliest days of the campaign, found deeply uncomfortable and, in some cases, genuinely offensive. More significantly, Alexander began incorporating elements of Persian court ceremony, including practices around royal audience and deference, that struck his Macedonian companions as fundamentally at odds with the more direct, personal, and relatively egalitarian relationship that had traditionally existed between Macedonian kings and their noble companions, where Macedonian tradition had generally permitted close companions and senior officers a degree of informal, direct access and even blunt, critical speech with their king. Persian royal tradition emphasized much more elaborate, hierarchical deference, including practices that some Greek and Macedonian observers considered to verge uncomfortably close to treating the king as something more than merely human. This tension came to a genuinely tragic head during an episode at the city of Maracanda, in the region of Sogdiana in Central Asia, during an evening of feasting and heavy drinking. Cleitus, the same veteran officer who had saved Alexander's life years earlier at the Granicus by cutting down the Persian nobleman about to strike him, grew increasingly critical as the wine flowed and tempers frayed of what he perceived as Alexander's growing arrogance, his increasing adoption of Persian customs, and his apparent willingness to diminish the genuine achievements of his father Philip and his veteran Macedonian officers, in favour of flattering courtiers eager to credit Alexander's successes to his own singular, even divine genius alone. The argument escalated rapidly and catastrophically. Alexander, enraged by Cleitus's increasingly pointed and public criticism in front of the assembled court, seized a spear from one of the nearby guards, and in a moment of drunken, uncontrolled fury killed Cleitus with it, the very man who had once saved his own life on a riverbank in Asia Minor years before. Ancient sources describe Alexander's reaction in the aftermath as one of genuine, overwhelming grief and horror at what he had done, once sobriety and the reality of the situation fully returned to him. He reportedly withdrew for several days, refusing food, weeping, and expressing profound remorse for the killing of a man who had been not just a loyal officer, but a close personal friend since childhood. Whether this grief reflects genuine moral anguish, the psychological weight of having crossed a line he had never previously crossed, even amid all the calculated brutality of his military campaigns, or some combination of authentic sorrow and awareness of how badly the episode threatened to damage his standing with his own officers and soldiers, we cannot fully separate at this distance in time. What remains clear is that this incident marks one of the darkest, most troubling moments of Alexander's entire life, a genuine tragedy born from wine, wounded pride, and the accumulating strain of years spent almost constantly at war, increasingly isolated by his own extraordinary and unprecedented success. This period of the campaign generally proved considerably more difficult and grinding than the dramatic set-piece battles against Darius that had characterized the earlier years of conquest. The regions of Bactria and Sogdiana, corresponding roughly to parts of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, presented Alexander with a fundamentally different kind of military challenge than the Persian imperial army had. Not large, formal battles that could be decided through a single decisive cavalry charge, but prolonged, exhausting guerrilla resistance from local tribal leaders and warlords who knew the difficult, mountainous terrain intimately and who refused to offer the kind of conventional set-piece confrontation at which Macedonian forces excelled. It took Alexander nearly 3 years of difficult, often frustrating campaigning to fully subdue resistance in this region, involving numerous smaller engagements, sieges of fortified mountain strongholds, and considerable losses among his own veteran soldiers, worn down by years of continuous campaigning far from home. It was also during this period, according to ancient accounts, that Alexander encountered and eventually married Roxana, a young noblewoman from Bactria, described by ancient sources as possessing extraordinary beauty, whom he reportedly first saw during a banquet celebrating the capture of a fortress where she and her family had taken refuge. Their marriage, whatever genuine personal affection may have existed between them, also served clear political purposes, helping to secure the loyalty of local Bactrian and Sogdian nobility through this direct dynastic connection to the new Macedonian ruling order being established across these distant eastern territories. With Bactria and Sogdiana finally subdued, Alexander's restless ambitions, remarkably, showed no sign of diminishing, even after nearly 6 years of continuous campaigning across thousands of miles. He turned his army further east still, toward a land that lay at the very edge of what most Greeks believed the inhabited world to contain: India. The campaign into the Indian subcontinent, beginning around 327 before our era, took Alexander's army into environments and encounters unlike anything they had experienced in the previous years of Persian and Central Asian campaigning. Dense, humid forests replaced the arid plains and mountain passes of Persia and Bactria. Monsoon rains, utterly unfamiliar to soldiers raised in the relatively dry Mediterranean and Central Asian climates, drenched the army for weeks at a stretch, causing considerable hardship, disease, and declining morale among troops who had never before experienced anything resembling this kind of relentless, saturating rainfall. Alexander's forces encountered, and in several cases fought against, various regional Indian kingdoms and tribal confederations along the way, but the most significant and dramatically remembered confrontation of this eastern campaign occurred along the banks of the Hydaspes River, against a powerful local ruler the Greeks called Porus, who commanded, among his other forces, a substantial contingent of war elephants, animals that Alexander's soldiers had encountered only in smaller numbers during the earlier campaign against Darius, and that presented genuinely novel tactical and psychological challenges on the battlefield. The battle at the Hydaspes, fought during difficult monsoon conditions that had swollen the river considerably and complicated Alexander's efforts to cross it undetected by Porus's forces waiting on the opposite bank, proved to be one of the most tactically demanding engagements of Alexander's entire career, requiring considerable ingenuity in managing a night crossing of the flooded river at a point some distance from Porus's main position, followed by a difficult, hard-fought battle against an enemy force that included not just infantry and cavalry, but the psychologically intimidating presence of dozens of war elephants, animals that Macedonian and Greek horses, unfamiliar with their scent and appearance, found genuinely terrifying, creating serious challenges for effective cavalry deployment during the engagement. Alexander's forces ultimately prevailed, through a combination of tactical flexibility, disciplined infantry formations adapted specifically to counter the elephant threat, and the same kind of decisive cavalry maneuvering that had proven successful throughout the campaign. Porus himself, wounded but captured after fighting with evident personal courage throughout the battle, was brought before Alexander, and when asked how he wished to be treated, is said to have replied simply that he wished to be treated as a king treats a king, a response that reportedly impressed Alexander sufficiently that he restored Porus to his throne as a subject, ally, ruling his territory on Alexander's behalf rather than removing or executing him as a defeated enemy. Another example of the calculated respect Alexander frequently extended toward defeated rulers whose continued loyal administration served his broader imperial interests. It was also here, during or shortly after this difficult campaign, that Alexander suffered the loss of his beloved horse Bucephalus, the same animal he had tamed as a boy of 12 or 13 back in the palace grounds of Pella, and who had carried him faithfully through every major campaign and battle since that day. Ancient accounts differ on the precise cause of the horse's death. Old age, given that Bucephalus would have been an unusually elderly warhorse by this point, combined with the exhaustion and hardship of the difficult Indian campaign, seems the most plausible explanation, though some ancient sources suggest wounds sustained during the battle itself. Alexander's grief was profound and genuine according to every surviving account, and he founded a city on the site, naming it Bujaphala in his old companion's honour, one final city among the many dozens he would establish across his empire, dedicated not to himself, but to the horse who had carried him faithfully across 3 continents and most of his adult life. Beyond the Hydaspes, Alexander intended to press further east still, driven by reports, whether accurate or exaggerated, of even greater kingdoms and territories lying beyond, toward the Ganges River and the heart of the Indian subcontinent. It was here, finally, after nearly 8 years of continuous, grueling campaigning across thousands upon thousands of miles, that Alexander's army, for the first and only time in the entire campaign, effectively refused to go any further. The circumstances of this refusal, occurring at the banks of a river called the Hyphasis, deserve careful and sympathetic attention, because they reveal something important not just about the limits of even Alexander's extraordinary powers of persuasion and command, but about the genuine, accumulated human toll that 8 years of nearly continuous warfare, marching and campaigning, had exacted on the ordinary soldiers who had followed him this entire, staggering distance from their homes in Macedon and Greece. Consider for a moment what these men had actually experienced. Many had left home as young soldiers under Philip's earlier campaigns, or had joined Alexander's army in its earliest days crossing the Hellespont, and had subsequently marched, fought, and endured hardship across a distance that, even by conservative estimates, likely exceeded 10,000 miles of cumulative movement through deserts, across mountain ranges, through monsoon-drenched forests utterly unlike anything in their Mediterranean homeland, fighting battles against Persian armies, Bactrian guerrilla fighters, and now Indian kings commanding terrifying war elephants. Many had suffered wounds. Many had watched close friends and companions die, not just in battle, but from disease, from the hardships of difficult marches through inhospitable terrain, from the countless smaller dangers that accumulate across years of continuous military campaigning, far from any secure, familiar home base. When word reached the army that Alexander intended to press still further east, toward reportedly even more powerful kingdoms, and even larger armies said to await them beyond the Hyphasis, something in the collective will of these exhausted, homesick veterans finally broke. Ancient sources describe a period of growing unrest and quiet refusal spreading through the camp, until it became clear, even to Alexander himself, that his army, for the first time in the entire campaign, was simply unwilling to continue advancing any further from home, regardless of the potential glory, wealth, or conquest that further advance might theoretically offer. Alexander responded initially with anger and, according to several accounts, attempted the same kind of personal persuasion and rhetorical appeal to glory and honor that had motivated his soldiers through so many previous hardships across the preceding years. When this failed to move the assembled army, he reportedly withdrew to his tent for several days in a kind of sullen, wounded isolation, refusing to see his officers, in what some historians have interpreted as an attempt to pressure his commanders into reconsidering through the implicit threat of his continued displeasure and withdrawal. But the army's resolve, remarkably, held firm even against this pressure, and eventually Alexander was forced to accept what may well have been the first genuine, unavoidable limit placed upon his ambitions by anyone or anything since he had first crossed into Asia 8 years earlier. He agreed to turn the army back, though even this concession was wrapped, according to ancient accounts, in careful political theatre. Alexander reportedly ordered the construction of oversized altars, camp fortifications, and equipment deliberately built to exaggerated proportions before departing the Hyphasis, intending, according to some sources, to leave behind evidence that would suggest to future observers that a race of giants, rather than ordinary men, had once marched this far into India, a final gesture of theatrical grandeur even in the moment of his one clear strategic retreat. The return journey westward, rather than offering the exhausted army a period of relief, in fact proved to be one of the most genuinely difficult and costly phases of the entire campaign. Alexander chose to lead a significant portion of his forces back through the Driftorian desert, a brutal, largely waterless expanse along the southern coast of modern Iran and Pakistan, a decision whose motivations ancient historians debate, some suggesting it reflected a genuine desire to accomplish something no previous army had survived, others suggesting more practical strategic considerations related to coordinating with the fleet moving along the coast under the command of his officer Nearchus. Whatever the underlying motivation, the crossing proved catastrophic. Extreme heat, scarce water, treacherous terrain, and inadequate supplies led to enormous losses among the army and the substantial number of camp followers, including women and children, who had accumulated around the military column across the years of campaigning. Ancient estimates of the losses suffered during this desert crossing vary considerably, but consistently describe it as one of the most devastating episodes of the entire campaign, in some ways a far more costly ordeal in purely human terms than any of the great battles against Persian or Indian forces had been. By the time Alexander's battered, exhausted forces finally emerged from the Driftorian desert and made their way back toward the Persian heartland, reuniting eventually with other portions of the army and the fleet that had taken separate, less devastating routes back westward, significant problems had accumulated across the vast territories Alexander had conquered during his years of absence in India and Central Asia. Several of the regional governors and administrators Alexander had appointed to oversee different provinces during his absence had, in various ways, abused their authority, engaged in corruption, or in some cases openly defied the authority of the distant king, apparently believing, given how far Alexander had travelled and how long he had been gone, that he might never return at all, or might return in too weakened a state to hold them properly accountable. Alexander responded to this news with the same decisive severity he had shown throughout his career toward those who challenged or betrayed his authority, ordering the execution of numerous officials found guilty of corruption or disloyalty during a series of purges that swept through the administrative structure of his empire during this period. It was also during this final phase of his life, back in the Persian heartland at the city of Susa, that Alexander undertook one of the most ambitious and, to his own Macedonian officers, genuinely controversial policies of his entire reign, a mass wedding ceremony conducted according to Persian custom, in which Alexander himself married 2 additional wives, both members of the former Persian royal family, while simultaneously arranging marriages between dozens of his senior Macedonian officers and women from prominent Persian noble families. This event, remembered by historians as the Susa weddings, reflected, with striking clarity, the broader vision that had increasingly come to define Alexander's understanding of his own empire during these later years of his life. Not simply a Macedonian conquest imposed upon a subjugated Persian population, but a genuine, deliberate fusion of Macedonian and Persian elites into a single unified ruling class, bound together through intermarriage, shared administrative service, and a blended court culture drawing on both Greek and Persian traditions simultaneously. This vision, however genuinely held by Alexander himself, met with considerable resistance and discomfort among many of his own veteran Macedonian officers and soldiers who had spent years fighting to conquer Persia and found this deliberate elevation of former enemies to positions of genuine partnership and equality within the new imperial order deeply uncomfortable, even threatening to their own sense of earned status and privilege as the original conquerors. This underlying tension erupted into open, serious unrest shortly afterward, at the city of Opis, when Alexander announced plans to discharge a substantial number of his oldest, most veteran Macedonian soldiers and send them home, while simultaneously continuing to incorporate growing numbers of Persian soldiers into his military forces, training them according to Macedonian methods, and equipping them with Macedonian-style weapons. The veteran soldiers, interpreting this policy as a troubling sign that Alexander intended to replace his loyal, long-serving Macedonian army with Persian troops, openly mutinied, refusing orders and voicing bitter, accumulated grievances not just about this specific policy, but about years of what many perceived as Alexander's growing personal remoteness, his adoption of Persian customs and dress, and his apparent diminishing regard for the loyal companions who had followed him across the entire staggering breadth of his conquests. Alexander's response to this mutiny, according to ancient accounts, proved to be one of the more emotionally revealing episodes of his final years. Rather than responding purely with the harsh discipline he had shown toward other challenges to his authority throughout the campaign, he instead delivered an impassioned speech to his assembled soldiers, reminding them of everything they had achieved and endured together since the earliest days of the campaign, expressing genuine hurt and anger at what he perceived as their ingratitude toward a king who had shared every hardship and danger alongside them, and eventually, according to the most dramatic accounts, announcing that he would proceed with his new Persian integrated army alone if his Macedonian veterans truly wished to abandon him. This appeal, whatever combination of genuine emotion and calculated persuasion it contained, ultimately succeeded in reconciling Alexander with his mutinous soldiers. A large feast of reconciliation followed, described by ancient sources in terms suggesting genuine, moving emotional reunion between Alexander and the veteran soldiers who had shared so much of his extraordinary journey across the preceding decade, even as the underlying policy of gradually integrating Persian soldiers and Persian administrative elites into his empire's structure continued to move forward regardless. The veteran soldiers who were released from service were sent home to Macedon under the command of the aging General Craterus, carrying with them substantial wealth and honours, while Alexander himself, along with the remainder of his forces, made his way toward the ancient city of Babylon, which he had apparently begun to envision as a new central capital for his vast, still expanding empire, a city positioned, strategically and symbolically, at the crossroads between the Mediterranean world of his Macedonian and Greek origins and the vast eastern territories of Persia, Bactria and India that his conquests had now brought under a single, unprecedented imperial authority. He would never have the chance to fully realize whatever ambitious plans he held for this new imperial capital, or for the further conquests of Arabia, and according to some ancient accounts, potentially even further west toward Carthage and beyond, that he appears to have been actively planning during these final months of his life. In the spring of 323 before our era, Alexander arrived in Babylon, one of the great ancient cities of Mesopotamia, its famous walls, temples, and hanging gardens representing, in the minds of many across the ancient world, one of the true wonders of human civilization. Here, amid preparations for further military campaigns and the ongoing administrative work of consolidating his vast empire, Alexander fell seriously ill, following an extended period of feasting and drinking with his companions. The precise nature of this final illness remains, even now, a subject of considerable historical debate and uncertainty, and it is worth approaching this final chapter of our story with the same careful, honest acknowledgement of uncertainty that has guided us throughout this account. Ancient sources describe a progression of illness, beginning with fever, followed by increasing weakness, difficulty speaking, and eventually the loss of consciousness over a period of approximately 10 to 12 days, before Alexander finally died in early June of 323 before our era, at the age of 32, having reigned as king for just under 13 years. Various theories have been proposed across the centuries to explain this sudden, relatively rapid decline of a man who had survived so many battle wounds and hardships across the preceding decade of nearly continuous campaigning. Some ancient sources, reflecting the persistent political intrigue and suspicion that had characterized so much of Macedonian court life throughout Alexander's entire lifetime, suggested poisoning, with various individuals within his own court named as potential suspects, though no convincing evidence for deliberate poisoning has ever been definitively established. Modern historians and medical researchers have proposed numerous alternative explanations over the years, ranging from malaria, typhoid fever, or other infectious diseases likely present in the swampy, mosquito-rich environment around Babylon, to the possibility that years of accumulated battle wounds, heavy drinking, and physical exhaustion from nearly continuous campaigning had simply finally overwhelmed a body that had been pushed to extraordinary limits for well over a decade. We cannot, with the evidence that survives to us today, offer a definitive answer to this medical mystery, and perhaps it is appropriate, in a story that has asked us throughout to hold uncertainty honestly, rather than manufacturing false certainty, to leave this final question appropriately open as well. What the ancient sources do preserve with somewhat more consistency are the final scenes surrounding Alexander's death. His soldiers, according to one especially moving account, filing past his bed in the final days of his illness, wishing simply to see their king one final time, as Alexander, too weak by this point to speak, reportedly raised his hand or moved his eyes in silent acknowledgement of each soldier who passed. And there is the famous, much discussed final exchange, recorded by several ancient historians, in which Alexander's officers, gathered around his deathbed, asked him to whom he wished to leave his vast empire, and Alexander, in his final, weakening moments, is said to have replied simply that he left it to the strongest, a response whose ambiguity, whether deliberate or simply a consequence of his failing physical condition, would prove tragically, catastrophically prophetic for the decades of conflict that followed his death. Alexander the Great died without a clear, undisputed adult heir capable of immediately assuming control of the empire he had built. His son by Roxana would not be born until months after his death. His half-brother, Aridaeus, suffered from some form of intellectual disability that made him, by the standards of the time, unsuitable for genuine independent rule. In the absence of clear succession, Alexander's empire, built across 13 extraordinary years through conquest, calculation, and an almost unimaginable degree of personal risk and ambition, began fragmenting almost immediately after his death, as his most senior generals, men who had marched beside him from the very beginning, who had shared in the dangers of the Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and the Hydaspes, turned against one another in a prolonged series of wars, eventually dividing the empire into several separate successor kingdoms that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world for the following 3 centuries. As we come now toward the end of our journey through this remarkable life, let us slow down and turn our attention gently away from the battles and the conquests towards something quieter and perhaps, in the end, more lasting. The question of what Alexander's extraordinary, brief life actually left behind, once the immediate chaos of his empire's fragmentation had eventually settled. The political empire Alexander built did not survive him intact, fractured as it was among rival successor generals within just a few years of his death. But the world those conquests had created, the vast network of connections, cultural exchange, and shared ideas that his campaigns had woven across territories from Greece to India, proved remarkably more durable than the political structures themselves. Consider the dozens of cities Alexander founded, or renamed, or reorganized across the territories of his empire, many bearing some variation of his own name, Alexandria in Egypt, which we have already discussed, growing into one of the great intellectual centers of the ancient world. Other cities named Alexandria scattered from Asia Minor through Central Asia and into the borderlands of India, several of which grew into significant, enduring centers of trade and culture that persisted for centuries after the political empire that spawned them had long since dissolved. Consider, too, the era that historians have come to call the Hellenistic period, the roughly 3 centuries following Alexander's death, during which Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek artistic styles, and Greek political and administrative concepts spread and blended with the local cultures of Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, and Central Asia in ways that would have been almost unimaginable before Alexander's conquests connected these previously more separate worlds together. Greek became a genuine common language of trade, administration, and intellectual exchange across a vast swath of the ancient world, a linguistic legacy that persisted long enough to shape, among many other things, the language in which early Christian texts would eventually be written and spread, centuries after Alexander's own death. Consider the exchange of ideas, plants, artistic techniques, and scientific knowledge that flowed, in both directions, along the networks of trade and communication that Alexander's conquests had established or expanded, from Central Asia through Persia to the Mediterranean world, and from the Mediterranean world eastward toward India, an early ancient precursor, in certain respects, to the later, more famous Silk Road trading networks that would eventually connect China with the Mediterranean world in subsequent centuries. And consider finally the sheer scale of the historical imagination Alexander's life ignited, an imagination that has persisted remarkably across more than 2,000 years since his death. Roman generals and emperors studied his campaigns and consciously modeled aspects of their own ambitions on his example. Medieval European, Islamic and Persian traditions all developed their own extensive bodies of legend and storytelling around his life, often blending historical memory with elaborate mythological embellishment, producing an entire genre of literature across multiple civilizations, sometimes referred to collectively as the Alexander Romance. Military commanders across the following centuries, into the modern era, have studied his tactical innovations and strategic decision-making as foundational case studies in the art of warfare and leadership. We should be honest, as we close this account, about the genuine complexity and moral weight of this legacy. Rather than allowing the undeniable historical fascination Alexander continues to generate to smooth away the real human cost of his conquests. Thebes destroyed, its population enslaved, Tyre besieged for 7 brutal months, thousands killed or enslaved in its final fall. The countless soldiers on both Macedonian and Persian sides who died across more than a decade of nearly continuous warfare, along with the civilian populations across 3 continents whose lives were disrupted, displaced or ended by the passage of Alexander's armies. The Gedrosian Desert crossing alone, a decision whose strategic necessity remains genuinely questionable to historians, cost an enormous, largely unnecessary toll in human suffering and death among soldiers and camp followers alike. Alexander was, by every honest measure the historical record allows us to construct, an extraordinarily gifted military commander, a man of genuine intellectual curiosity nurtured by one of history's greatest philosophers, a leader capable of inspiring extraordinary loyalty and devotion among those who followed him across thousands of miles of hardship and danger. He was also, simultaneously and without contradiction, a man capable of ordering the annihilation of entire cities, of executing rivals and even close friends in moments of fury or calculated political necessity, whose restless, apparently insatiable ambition for glory and conquest brought immense suffering to millions of people across the ancient world, in pursuit of a vision of unified empire that even he, in the end, did not live long enough to fully realize or explain. Perhaps this is, in the end, the most honest way to understand him. Not as a simple hero, and not as a simple villain, but as a profoundly human figure, shaped by a mother's fierce conviction of destiny, a father's hard-won kingdom and unfinished ambitions, a philosopher's careful training in reason and inquiry, and an ancient poem about a warrior who chose glory over a long, quiet life. All of it combining, across 32 remarkable and often devastating years, into one of the most consequential lives in the entire span of recorded human history. Somewhere in Babylon, in that early summer of 323 before our era, in a room within a palace that had once belonged to Persian kings, a young man who had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers that no army from his homeland had ever crossed before, who had stood at the edge of the world as his own culture understood it, finally grew still. Outside, the soldiers who had followed him from Macedon, from Greece, from Persia, from Bactria, and from India, continued the ordinary rhythms of camp life, unaware, in those final days, of just how completely the world they had helped build was about to change. Somewhere, perhaps, a young Macedonian soldier who had marched the entire distance from Pella sat mending a worn strap of leather in the evening light, thinking, perhaps, of home, of mountains he had not seen in over a decade, of a life that this campaign, this restless, extraordinary king, had carried him thousands of miles away from everything he had once known. We do not know most of their names, these ordinary soldiers, farmers, merchants, and camp followers who lived through this extraordinary period of history alongside the man whose name it carries. But their lives, quiet and largely unrecorded, were as real and in their own way as significant as the great kings whose story we have followed tonight. They too felt the desert heat of Godrosia, the monsoon rains of India, the strange cold mountain air of Bactria and Sogdiana. They too wondered, in their private moments, whether they would ever see home again, and many of them, in the end, did not. If you are still awake, drifting somewhere in these final quiet passages, let your mind rest now on something simpler than empires and conquest. Let it rest on the ordinary human wish, shared across every century and every civilization, for a peaceful place to lay one's head, a safe distance from danger, a quiet stretch of night in which nothing more is asked of you than to simply rest. The story of Alexander the Great is in many ways a story about restlessness, about a mind and a will that seemingly could never quite settle, could never simply stop at what had already been achieved, however extraordinary. It is worth remembering as we close this account and let the ancient world settle back into stillness, that such restlessness, however remarkable its historical achievements, is not in itself a peaceful way to live a life. Alexander himself, if the ancient sources capturing his private reflections and conversations hold any truth at all, seems to have wondered, in quieter moments, whether the endless pursuit of ever more glory and ever more conquest had brought him anything resembling genuine contentment. We will never know, with certainty, what final thoughts passed through his mind in those last days in Babylon. But perhaps there is something gently instructive, even now, in the contrast between his extraordinary restless life and the simple universal rest that every one of us, king or soldier, ancient or modern, eventually shares. Let yourself have that rest now. The mountains of Macedon have long since settled back into their quiet, ancient patience. The causeway at Tyre, worn by more than 2,000 years of tides, eventually became simply part of the coastline itself, no longer remembered by most who walk across it today as anything but ordinary land. The palace at Persepolis lies now in graceful, weathered ruin beneath a wide desert sky, visited by travellers who walk quietly among its broken columns, imagining, perhaps, the feasting and firelight of that long ago night. And somewhere in the gentle dark of wherever you are resting tonight, the story closes softly, the way all such stories eventually must, leaving behind only the quiet, patient turning of the world, and whatever rest you are able now to finally allow yourself. Sleep well. This concludes our documentary on the life of Alexander the Great for the Driftorian.